Fleet Commander Threl Vashka had commanded the Ashenlight, flagship of the Sevrin Ascendancy's ninth bloom, for 140 years, and in that century and a half he had never once heard the choir go silent. The choir was older than his species' written history. It was the resonance web that bound every Sevrin warship to every other, a living harmonic broadcast from the crystalline seed core at the heart of each vessel, singing status and position and intent to its siblings across the dark. No Sevrin ship had ever needed to encrypt its voice, because no other voice in the galaxy had ever answered back. 40,000 years of unbroken dominion had taught the Ascendancy a single unshakable truth. Nothing spoke the choir's language but the choir itself. Threl stood on the transparent dais of the Ashenlight's bridge, watching the amber threads of 10,000 ships pulse gently on the tactical bloom above him, and he felt, as he always did, a kind of reverent calm. Below that calm, unnoticed, a thin new thread had begun to hum, a note that did not belong to any hull in his registry. He did not yet know to be afraid of it. That would come later, in the dark, when the choir turned its voice against him. But that was hours away. First, there was a war to remember losing his way into. It had begun, as these things always began, with contempt. The scout bloom Varitha's needle found the third planet of an unremarkable yellow star, and reported back with the mild curiosity of a naturalist cataloging a new species of moss. The inhabitants called themselves humans. They had crude fusion drives, no resonance technology whatsoever, and this was the detail that made the analysts on Threl's staff laugh into their reports. They still argued with each other about how to organize themselves into nations. Division. Noise. A species too busy fighting itself to notice the universe. The Ascendancy's protocol for such discoveries was ancient and simple. Contact, demand tribute and submission, accept the inevitable capitulation, absorb the world into the bloom. It had worked 912 times. Threl remembered the transmission he sent personally, more out of curiosity than necessity. He wanted to hear how a species with no resonance song would sound, speaking through crude radio waves scraped together from electromagnetic noise. The reply came back 11 hours later, translated by machines that had never before needed to translate defiance. We're gonna have to say no to that one. Not fear, not fury, something almost like amusement. Threl had laughed, actually laughed, a rare and startling sound on the Ashenlight's bridge, and his junior officers had laughed with him, because surely this was a species that did not understand what it was refusing. Beneath Earth's cities, in rooms with far less light and far more desperation than Threl's gleaming bridge, humans understood exactly what they were refusing. They simply did not have a better option. In a converted parking structure outside what had once been Lagos, a woman named Dr. Naomi Osei stood over a table covered in fragments of alien hull plating, salvage from the Varitha's needle's brief and fatal reconnaissance pass through a human missile test range 6 months earlier, an accident on both sides, a scout ship too curious and a defense grid too jumpy, and the wreckage it left behind had become the single most valuable object on the planet. Naomi had spent 4 months trying to get the crystalline core inside one fist-sized hull fragment to do anything at all. It hummed. It glowed faintly amber when powered. It did not respond to a single protocol her team threw at it. "It's not a computer," she told the assembled generals, 3 days before the ultimatum arrived. Or, "It is, but not like ours. It doesn't compute. It resonates. It's built to trust anything that speaks its frequency, because in 40,000 years nothing else ever has." She held up the fragment, and it glowed, patient and ancient and utterly unsuspicious. "I think if we ever learn to speak this language, it won't just listen to us. It'll obey us. It has no reason not to." Nobody in that room had the resources to make that promise mean anything yet. It was a scientist's hope, filed away, unfunded, unfinished, the kind of detail easily lost among the 1,000 more urgent fires of an impending war. General Okoro Dunladi, who chaired that meeting and would go on to chair 100 more like it, remembered Naomi's presentation less for its content than for the silence that followed it. Nobody in the room had a rebuttal. Nobody had the money either. Human industry, scattered across dozens of nations that still filed border disputes against each other, even as an alien fleet gathered somewhere above them, could not agree fast enough to fund a research program built on a fragment of hull plating and a hunch. It took the ultimatum itself, the cold, formal demand for submission, broadcast in a machine-translated voice to every government on the planet simultaneously, to do what 4 months of budget hearings could not. Within 72 hours of that transmission, 31 countries had quietly folded their militaries, their treasuries, and their most stubborn secrets into a single command structure nobody had bothered to name yet, because nobody had time left to argue about names. The punitive fleet that Threll's superiors dispatched was not, by Ascendancy standards, an overwhelming force. 40 ships. A demonstration, not a conquest. Humanity would be shown a fraction of what waited above them, and then it would kneel, as everyone always eventually knelt. It arrived above the human colony platform at Meridian Station, a modest orbital shipyard that represented, at the time, roughly a third of humanity's off-world industrial capacity. The battle that followed lasted 11 minutes. Human ships were slow. Their weapons were unrefined kinetic railguns and chemical warheads that Sevrin point defense swatted from the sky like insects. Their armor cracked under energy weapons that Sevrin cadets trained on for sport. Meridian Station's defense fleet, 18 vessels, crewed by people who had, 3 weeks earlier, been running cargo routes and asteroid surveys, died in a light show that Threll watched from the Ashenlight with the detached professional interest of a man reviewing a training exercise. He noted, almost as an afterthought, a peculiarity in the engagement data his tactical officer flagged mid-battle. Several of the human vessels, rather than attempting to flee once their weapons were spent, altered course directly into the heart of the Sevrin formation. Point defense handled them easily enough, crude ships, no shielding worth mentioning, but the intent struck Threll as strange. A crude vessel with no remaining offense, driving itself toward the densest concentration of enemy fire, was not a maneuver his doctrine had a name for. His officer suggested panic, disorientation, poor training. Threll filed the observation and did not think of it again for 6 weeks, which was, in hindsight, exactly long enough for it to matter. What he could not see from the Ashenlight's bridge was the reason for that maneuver. Aboard the freighter Amaranth, converted 3 weeks earlier from hauling grain to hauling whatever weapon its shipyard could bolt to its hull in time, a pilot named Foster Alvarez had understood before anyone briefed him that his ship was not going to survive the engagement regardless of what he did with it. His systems officer, a 22-year-old named Priya Anand on her first combat deployment, spent the final 90 seconds of the Amaranth's life feeding every sensor reading the ship could gather, targeting solutions, shield harmonics, weapon cycle times, into a compressed burst transmission aimed at Earth, rather than at any weapon that might have bought them another minute of life. Foster steered the dying freighter toward the thickest cluster of Sevrin point defense fire he could find, not out of panic, but because a ship dying inside enemy sensor range transmitted more useful data than a ship dying at the edge of it. He did not survive to know whether the data mattered. It did. What he remembered afterward, what actually stayed with him, was not the ease of the victory. It was the last transmission from the station commander, a woman named Captain Idawu Chin, broadcast in the clear on every frequency as her ship broke apart around her. "This isn't the end of anything. You just made it personal." Her voice did not shake. Threll had listened to 912 capitulations in his archives, and none of them sounded like that. He filed it away as an anomaly. He would not get the chance to forget it. In the weeks after Meridian, humanity did not surrender, and it did not counterattack in any way the Ascendancy's war doctrine had a category for. Ships kept flying sorties against the occupying fleet, small, badly coordinated, and consistently suicidally unsuccessful. Threll's staff began to speak of humans with the specific contempt reserved for things that refused to understand they had already lost. Every human vessel that limped out to challenge the blockade and died did so a little more cleverly than the last, which the Sevrin read as increasing desperation, rather than what it actually was, increasing data. Because humans were not fighting to win those engagements. They were fighting to learn. Every dead human ship fed telemetry back to teams like Naomi's, targeting solutions, shield harmonics, the exact resonance frequency Sevrin point defense used to distinguish friend from foe. And every dead Sevrin fighter, every wrecked hull that drifted instead of vaporizing, became something more valuable than any battle Threll's fleet won. Raw material and a lesson. The first thing humanity built with that material was not a weapon. It was a lie. 6 weeks after Meridian, a Sevrin escort squadron patrolling the debris field above the ruined station picked up 4 friendly resonance signatures approaching from the wreckage, Ascendancy IFF codes, authentic down to the harmonic signature, broadcasting distress. Standard Sevrin doctrine was unambiguous. A ship of the choir in distress is retrieved, never abandoned. The squadron peeled off to render aid. The 4 distressed ships were derelict Sevrin fighter hulls, gutted, stuffed with every gram of human explosive that could be crammed into a crystalline core casing, and wired to detonate the instant a Sevrin tractor beam engaged. 3 Sevrin escorts died in the resulting fireball. It was the first battle of the war that humanity actually won, and it was won with the enemy's own wreckage, powered by a stolen frequency and a scientist's 4-month-old hunch that had finally, quietly found its funding. Threll received the report in his private quarters, and for the first time since the war began, he did not feel contempt. He felt something colder and more precise, the beginning of a question he would spend the rest of the war trying and failing to answer. What, exactly, are we fighting? 3 of the escort's crew survived the ambush, recovered hours later by a rescue tender that arrived long after the human forces had withdrawn. Threll interviewed the senior survivor himself, a young weapons officer named Vesethrenal, who had spent his entire career believing, as every Sevrin child was raised to believe, that the choir could not be corrupted, only silenced. Ves described the ordinary, unremarkable relief of hearing a sibling ship confirm itself, the tractor beam engaging on pure reflex, the world ending half a second later in a way his training had never modeled as possible. He was unhurt in body. Threll dismissed him from active duty anyway, because a mind that has been made to doubt the choir cannot fight beside it with the same certainty again, and Threll suspected, watching Ves leave the debriefing room, that within a year every pilot in the fleet would carry some version of that same doubt, whether or not they had been there to earn it firsthand. His superiors did not share the question. Grand Marshal Sevrin Kell, who commanded the Ascendancy's 3rd Fleet from a listening post 4 systems away, and had never once been shot at by anything more dangerous than protocol, read the same report and heard only an ambush, clever, certainly, but a trick, a single trick, not a threat. He ordered escalation. 200 ships, this time. Enough to end the argument. Threll requested, and was denied, permission to first study the wreckage his people had captured intact from the failed decoy attack. Sevrin's answer arrived stamped with the seal of 40,000 years of unbroken victory. We do not need to understand insects to step on them. Threll obeyed. He had spent a century and a half learning that obedience was the price of command, and he told himself, as the 9th Bloom moved to reinforce the blockade, that the Grand Marshal was very probably correct. He was thinking of Captain Idawu Chen's voice when the second wave of decoys came in. This time it was not a trick built from 4 fighter hulls. It was a trick built from an entire graveyard. In the 8 weeks since Meridian, human salvage crews, flying under a level of secrecy that would have gotten several admirals court-martialed if their governments had still fully trusted each other, which, remarkably, this particular crisis had begun to change, had recovered and quietly stockpiled every recoverable fragment of Sevrin wreckage within 3 light hours of Earth. Not just hull plating, cores, engines, whole derelict frames, some barely more than skeletons, towed with agonizing slowness into hidden holding patterns behind the moon and inside the asteroid debris of a system the Sevrin scouts had surveyed and dismissed as empty. Naomi Osei's team, grown from 4 exhausted engineers to 400, had done something Threll's civilization had never once needed to do in 40,000 years. They had learned to forge a voice in the choir. Not perfectly, not elegantly. Human resonance transmitters were crude, jury-rigged, ugly things soldered onto stolen Sevrin cores, cracked casings held together with epoxy, cooling systems borrowed from decommissioned submarines, control interfaces that still, absurdly, used keyboards, but they worked because the choir had never been built to doubt itself, and something that has never learned suspicion cannot easily learn it in 8 weeks. Naomi remembered the night the first prototype held a stable signal for 11 full seconds before burning out, and how the lab had gone up in a cheer so loud that a colonel 3 rooms away came running with a sidearm drawn, certain the building was under attack. In a way, she told him afterward, it was just not the kind he expected, and not aimed at anyone in that room. There was, inevitably, an argument about whether to use it. A council of scientists, generals, and a handful of survivors from Meridian Station convened in a bunker outside what had once been Geneva, and for 2 days they argued not about whether the weapon would work. Naomi's data left little room for doubt, but about what kind of war it would make them fight. Captain Elias Vance, who had escaped Meridian intact, argued against it first and hardest. We fight them honestly and we lose honestly, he said. We fight them like this and win, and I'm not sure what we've built ourselves into by the end of it. It was Priya Anand, newly assigned to the program after Idawu Chen's death, who answered him in a voice that ended the argument. They didn't ask us how we wanted to fight this war. They only offered us the terms of losing it. I'd rather be something I don't fully recognize and alive than recognizable and gone. The vote, when it came, was not unanimous. It did not need to be. When Sevrin 200 ships arrived to crush the human blockade runners once and for all, 40 of them found themselves suddenly, silently, joined by 12 more, derelict Sevrin hulls, dead for weeks, rising out of the debris field and slotting into the Ascendancy's own formation as if they had never left it. Their resonance signatures were flawless. Their weapons, cannibalized and rewired by human hands from a dozen other wrecks, were live. They opened fire from inside the formation. There is no doctrine, in 40,000 years of doctrine, for a friendly ship that is not friendly. Sevrin Point Defense, tuned across millennia to distinguish outsider from choir, looked at 12 ships singing the correct song and saw only siblings. It did not fire back. It could not conceive of the need. 6 Ascendancy warships died before Sevrin's fleet even understood it was under attack from within its own ranks. And by the time the survivors broke formation in confused, undisciplined panic, a word Threll had genuinely never expected to apply to Sevrin pilots. The human blockade runners that had been the actual bait struck the disordered fleet from 3 directions at once. Sevrin lost 31 ships that day. He would later report it, in the sanitized language of a career that had never before required honesty about failure, as unexpected asymmetric losses. Threll, monitoring the engagement from the Ashen Light, 3 systems distant and helpless to intervene, understood the report for what it was. The first crack in 40,000 years of certainty. On Earth, the victory did not feel like victory to the people who had built it. Naomi Osei watched the recovered footage in a briefing room gone completely silent, and what she noticed, what she could not stop noticing, was how long it took the escort squadron to fire back. Nearly 4 full seconds of Sevrin pilots simply failing to comprehend what was happening to them, hands frozen on controls that had never been trained for betrayal. She had built the weapon that did that. She had spent 8 weeks certain it was the only weapon she had left to build, and she still went home that night and did not sleep, because there was a difference she was discovering between believing a thing necessary and feeling clean about having done it. Malik Rios, 3 seats down the table, understood the feeling better than he wanted to. He had flown the remote console for 2 of the 12 derelict hulls, and had heard, faintly, over a leaked channel nobody had bothered to encrypt, a Sevrin pilot say something in his last half-second that the translation software rendered, imperfectly, as a question rather than a scream. Malik never repeated what the question was. He did not think it would change what any of them had to do next, and he had learned, since his sister's death above Meridian Station, not to spend grief on things it could not undo. He requested the wreckage data again. This time, no one was in a position to deny him. What he found, alone in his quarters at an hour when even his most senior officers had gone to sleep, made the calm reverence he had always felt toward the choir curdle into something closer to grief. His people had built ships that trusted implicitly, that sang the truth because they had never once needed to lie, and humans, who had needed to lie to each other for their entire violent, divided, quarrelsome history, had looked at that trust and understood immediately, instinctively, exactly how to violate it. It's not that they're stronger than us, he wrote in a private log he suspected he would never send. It's that we built a civilization on the assumption that nothing would ever need to deceive us, and they are a species built entirely from the practice of deceiving each other. We taught them our language by refusing to imagine anyone could speak it against us. He thought again of Captain Iduuchin. You just made it personal. He was beginning to understand that she had not been speaking to the Ascendancy at all. She had been speaking to every human listening, telling them what kind of war this was going to be, not a war of ships, but a war of anyone willing to think in ways the enemy hadn't prepared for. He raised the matter, carefully, with his second-in-command, a younger officer named Dessa Urel, who had trained under him for 11 years, and whom he trusted more than he trusted most of the council. We built a civilization that never had to lie to survive, he told her, late in the ship's cycle when the bridge ran on skeleton crew, and the amber light of the tactical bloom was the only light either of them needed. I wonder now whether that was ever a strength at all, or simply a debt we hadn't yet been asked to pay. Dessa had no answer for him. She was young enough that the question had not yet had time to frighten her the way it frightened Threll, and old enough to recognize, watching her commander's face in the dim light, that it eventually would. On Earth, the mood was not triumphant. It was exhausted and grieving and grimly determined in the specific way of people who have run out of easier options. Naomi Osei stood in a briefing room lit by emergency power. The Sevrin blockade had, in retaliation for Osavain's humiliation, begun targeting surface power infrastructure, and looked at a room of admirals who, 6 months ago, would not have taken her calls. "We can't outbuild them," she said. "We can't outgun them. Every ship we lose is a ship we can't replace for years. But every ship they lose," she gestured at a display crowded with the debris fields ringing Earth, fields that had once represented only loss and now represented something else entirely, "is a weapon we haven't built yet." Beside her, a salvage pilot named Malik Rios said nothing. He had flown one of the 4 decoy hulls in the first ambush, remotely, from a console 200 kilometers away, and he had watched, through a borrowed sensor feed, as the Sevrin escort that his rigged ship killed had spent its last half-second reaching out with a tractor beam meant to save it. He had not been able to stop thinking about that half-second since. He was not sure some nights whether what his people were doing was clever or simply cruel, and he had decided, in the specific way soldiers decide things they cannot fully resolve, that he would keep doing it anyway, because Idawu Chun had been his sister, and because the alternative was watching the rest of his species die kneeling. The Ascendancy's response was not caution. It was fury dressed as strategy. Osavain Kell, stripped of the confidence that had defined his entire career, made the argument that had ended every war the Sevrin had ever fought. Overwhelming force ends all cleverness. He petitioned the Autarka's council directly, bypassing Threll's more measured recommendations, and received what he asked for, the mobilization of the Grand Bloom itself, the entire war readiness of the Sevrin Ascendancy, more ships than had left home space in 11,000 years. 900 warships. Enough, Osavain argued, that no trick, no ambush, no clever human deception could possibly matter against sheer overwhelming mass. Threll was given command of the Vanguard, not out of trust, but because the council wanted a veteran voice steadying the fleet's nerve after Osavain's humiliation. He accepted the command with a hollow feeling he did not share with anyone, and in the weeks before the Grand Bloom's departure, he did something none of his peers would have understood. He requested, and was granted, a private audience with a captured human prisoner, one of Malik Rios's fellow pilots, shot down and recovered alive during a failed sortie. The prisoner, a young engineer named Priya Anand, sat across from Threll in a containment field designed to hold something far more dangerous than a frightened 26-year-old, and answered his one real question honestly, because she had decided there was no strategic value left in lying about it. "Why do you keep fighting?" Threll asked, through the translation lattice. "You cannot win. You have never been able to win. Every ship you kill of ours costs you people you cannot replace either." Priya was quiet for a long moment. "You're going to win the war," she said finally. "Probably. I think everybody down there knows that, somewhere underneath the parts of us that refuse to admit it." She looked up at him, and Threll saw something in her expression that he recognized uncomfortably from every mirror he had avoided since Meridian. "But you're not going to win it the way you expected. And I think that matters to us more than winning does. We wanted you to have to remember us." Threll did not sleep well after that conversation. He kept thinking about the choir, about 40,000 years of ships that had never needed to lie, and about a species that had apparently decided that being remembered was worth more than being spared. The Grand Bloom departed home space 3 days later. 900 ships, in formation so vast it took the choir's resonance web 4 full seconds to complete a single pulse across its length, moved toward Earth with the ponderous, absolute confidence of a civilization that had never once been made to doubt its own strength. They did not know they were sailing into a graveyard that had been waiting for them for months. What Threll did not learn until the final battle, what nobody on the human side had told even most of their own pilots, for the same reason no successful ambush explains itself in advance, was the true scope of what Naomi Osei's 400 engineers, and the 4,000 more who had since joined them across a dozen nations that had stopped pretending they were separate countries the moment survival made unity cheap, had actually built in the year since Meridian Station burned. Every scrap of Sevrin wreckage recovered since the first battle, hundreds of hulls, thousands of engine cores, an entire debris field stretching from lunar orbit out past the asteroid belt, had been quietly, patiently rebuilt. Not into a fleet. Humanity did not have the shipyards or the years for a fleet. Into something the Ascendancy had no doctrine for at all. A minefield built from the Ascendancy's own dead, singing the Ascendancy's own song, waiting in the debris fields that Sevrin Sensor Doctrine had long ago learned to overlook as harmless clutter, because in 40,000 years, clutter had never once been armed. The Grand Bloom entered the debris field above Earth in perfect formation, 900 ships moving through the wreckage of every battle the war had produced, and the choir sang the way it always sang, until all at once, in every direction, hundreds of dead ships answered back. Threll felt the resonance web shudder before his sensors confirmed what was happening. Hulls that had been drifting silent and cold for the better part of a year woke up singing the correct song, in correct formation, at correct distances, and then opened fire on their supposed siblings from every angle a graveyard of 900 previous engagements had left available. It was not a clean, singular ambush like the one that had humiliated Sevrin. It was worse. It was distributed across the entire debris field, hundreds of separate charges and rewired weapons and jury-rigged engines driven at collision speed into hulls that never saw them as anything but their own dead come home. For the first time in 140 years of command, Fleet Commander Threll Vashka felt something he had no vocabulary for, because his language had never needed a word for it. The specific, vertiginous horror of watching your own fleet's trust in itself become the weapon that kills it. Ships that should have raised shields raised nothing, because shields were not built to guard against the choir. Point defense that should have fired held its aim, because point defense had never been taught that the choir could lie. "They're using our ships," he said aloud, to no one, watching amber threads on the tactical bloom wink out by the dozens. "They built their entire war out of the parts of us we let die." The battle that followed was not the clean, overwhelming annihilation Sevrin had promised the Council. It was chaos, 900 ships trying to fight an enemy that had already, invisibly, embedded itself inside their own formation weeks before the battle began, alongside a human fleet that finally, for the first time in the war, met the Ascendancy on something closer to equal footing, not because human ships had grown stronger, but because a third of the Sevrin fleet was already burning from the inside before the humans fired a single shot of their own. Threll made the only decision that mattered that day. He broke formation, an act that would have been unthinkable a year earlier, a violation of 11,000 years of doctrine, and pulled the Ashen Light and everything he could still command clear of the debris field entirely, into open space where the choir could be trusted again, where nothing wore his people's voice but his people. It cost him the Vanguard's coherence. It saved perhaps 400 ships that would otherwise have died confused, trusting their own dead. Sevrin Kell did not break formation. He held the center, certain until the very end that mass alone would still decide the outcome, and the center did not survive the day. By the time the debris field went quiet again, the Grand Bloom that had left home space 900 strong had lost just over half its number, not primarily to human weapons, but to itself, to a trust it had never learned to question, wielded back against it by a species that trusted almost nothing by comparison, and had built an entire strategy on that difference. Sevrin Kell died in the center of that formation, aboard his flagship Everdawn, in the final minutes before its own escort, 3 ships he had personally decorated for valor 2 years earlier. Now singing a stolen song from inside a debris field, he had ordered them straight through, put torpedoes into his engine core at point-blank range. His last transmission reached Threll's tactical array only as noise. Not words, just the raw static of a mind that had spent an entire career certain overwhelming force could not fail, discovering in its final seconds that certainty itself had been the vulnerability all along. Aboard the Ashen Light, Threll watched his own displays with the sick clarity of a man who had tried and failed to prevent exactly this outcome. He gave the order to break formation not as a tactician calculating odds, but as a commander who had run out of reasons to believe the old doctrine would save anyone else that day. 400 ships followed him clear of the debris field in a maneuver, so far outside 11,000 years of protocol, that 3 of his own squadron commanders initially refused the order, certain it must be a corrupted transmission, one more voice in the choir that could no longer be trusted. Threll broadcasted a second time, in his own voice, unencrypted, repeating his service number and the exact coordinates of his own birth world, details no imitation could easily fabricate. It was, he later reflected, the first time in the war either side had needed to prove itself honest to its own people. The squadron commanders followed him. It was the only decision of the battle he never doubted afterward. Threll stood on the Ashen Light's bridge, watching the survivors of his shattered Vanguard limp into formation around him, and for the second time in the war, he heard a human voice broadcast in the clear on every frequency his sensors could reach. It was not a Dewuchin. It was Naomi Osei, offering, on behalf of a species that had just won the largest battle of its short history as a spacefaring civilization, something the Ascendancy's 900 years of contact protocol had no category for either. Not surrender terms. Not gloating. An offer to stop. "You came here to make us kneel," her voice said, steady, clearly exhausted, clearly speaking to more than one audience. "We're not going to. But we don't want to keep killing each other over it. And we don't think you do either. Not really, not the ones of you who actually had to watch this happen. Pull your remaining ships back past the debris field, and we will let every one of you go home. All of you. We're not interested in a massacre. We were only ever interested in making you stop." There was no tactical reason for humanity to make that offer. The Ascendancy's shattered Vanguard was still, in raw numbers, more than capable of continuing the fight, if barely, if bled white. Threll understood, listening to it, that the offer was not tactical at all. It was the same thing Priya Anand had told him in the containment field, translated now from one prisoner's private honesty into a declaration broadcast across an entire war. Humanity had not fought to win in the way the Ascendancy understood winning. They had fought to be impossible to forget, and having proven that, they saw no further point in killing anyone who did not still insist on trying to kill them. Threll gave the order to withdraw. It was the first order of his century and a half of service that he was certain, absolutely certain, was correct. The Grand Marshal's Council would spend years arguing over what had happened above Earth, and longer still deciding what to call a species that had ended a war not by matching the Ascendancy's strength, but by teaching its own strength to turn against it. Other species, watching from the careful distance that news of the battle eventually reached, began to look at the Sevrin Ascendancy differently, not as an unbroken 40,000-year certainty, but as something that had finally, once, been made to bleed, and had been made to bleed by the newest, smallest, least advanced culture it had ever encountered. Delegations arrived at Earth's outer defense perimeter within the year, cautious and formal, uncertain how to address a species that had ended a war against the galaxy's oldest power without either losing or fully winning in any way their own histories had a word for. Some came seeking alliance. Some came only to look, the way one looks at a fire that burned down a house everyone had assumed was fireproof. President Elena Cortez, who had spent the war holding together a fragile human unity nobody expected to survive the peace, met the first of them personally, and when asked what humanity wanted in exchange for its restraint, gave an answer quoted, imperfectly, in a dozen languages for years afterward. "We don't want anything from you we didn't already have to fight the Ascendancy to keep. We just want it understood, everywhere this story travels, that we were never as small as anyone assumed. On Earth, there was no single moment of triumph, no parade wide enough to hold everyone who had lost someone to get there." Malik Rios stood at the edge of a debris field that had, for one impossible year, been humanity's only real weapon, and thought about his sister's voice, still logged somewhere in a military archive, still saying the same 6 words she had died saying. You just made it personal. He thought that she would have understood, better than most, exactly what it had cost to make that true. Threll Vashkan never fully explained, to his own satisfaction or anyone else's, why the species that beat him had been the one made of division and doubt and constant internal argument, rather than his own, forged from 40,000 years of unbroken, trusting unity. But in the quiet years that followed, writing what would eventually become required reading in every Ascendancy War college, he came to a conclusion he believed was true, even if it had cost his people more than he could ever report in full. A civilization that has never needed to doubt itself will always be the last to notice when it should. And a species built from nothing but disagreement, distrust, and the hard daily work of finding unity anyway, will always know exactly how fragile trust is, because they have never once been allowed to take it for granted. Humanity had not won by building a stronger choir. They had won by understanding, in a way the Ascendancy never had, that even the most beautiful harmony is only ever one honest lie away from turning into a weapon. It was, Threll wrote, the last line anyone at the War College ever managed to argue him out of. We taught them to sing in our voice by never imagining they would learn the song. They taught us, in return, that nothing sings forever without someone, somewhere, finally asking why they were never allowed to sing anything else.